It was just another ordinary morning in the quiet town of Ekot, a place where everyone knew everyone, and life seemed to unfold in an unhurried rhythm. Amina, a devoted wife and mother, woke up early as she had done for the past 10 years. Her husband, Kofi, was still asleep beside her, snoring lightly. The warmth of their home, the familiar scent of her husband's cologne, and the peaceful sound of the birds outside made everything feel normal, perfect, even. Amina had always prided herself on her ability to maintain a balance between her family life and her small local business, a bakery that had become the heart of the town. It was small but thriving, and she poured her heart into every loaf of bread, every pastry, every batch of cookies. She had always believed in the simple joys of life, and this was her world, quiet, steady, and safe. Kofi, her husband, was the man she had married fresh out of university. He was everything she had wanted in a partner: charming, ambitious, and hardworking. Over the years, they'd built a life together, a life full of love, children, and shared dreams. Amina often smiled when she thought about their first meeting. Kofi had been a young, eager graduate at a job fair, and she had been the confident, outgoing student helping to organize the event. Their connection had been instant. What started as small talk soon became the foundation of their relationship, and in time, they got married. As the years passed, they grew together. Kofi landed a well-paying job in a nearby city, and they were able to buy a small but cozy house in the outskirts of Ekot. They had 2 children, and Amina managed to balance motherhood, business, and being the supportive wife to Kofi, who worked long hours to provide for their family. To outsiders, their marriage seemed enviable, a perfect picture of success and happiness. But, beneath the surface, there were cracks that neither Amina nor Kofi acknowledged. Amina had noticed subtle changes in Kofi's behavior over the past few months. Small things at first: he would stay late at work more often, his phone would ring at odd hours, and he became more distant in their conversations. It was nothing that screamed infidelity, but Amina couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her intuition, honed through years of knowing Kofi's every move and gesture, told her that there was more to the story than what he was letting on. Still, she had no real proof, just a gnawing feeling that refused to let her rest. She brushed it aside as paranoia, blaming the pressures of her bakery, the kids' growing needs, and the daily stresses of life. But as the days passed, the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, gnawing at her every time Kofi came home later than usual or when he seemed distracted during their conversations. Her heart would ache with every unanswered question she dared not ask. Could it be that Kofi, the man she had trusted with her life, was slipping away from her? One night, after a particularly long day at work, Amina found herself waiting up for Kofi. The children were asleep, and the house was eerily quiet. She sat in the living room, the soft light of a lamp casting shadows on the walls, and her thoughts swirled around her like a storm. When Kofi finally came home, it was nearly midnight, his steps slow and heavy, as though he had been carrying a weight much greater than his body. Amina looked at him, and for the first time, she saw him not as the man she loved, but as a stranger, someone who was now foreign to her. "You're late," she said softly, her voice calm despite the turmoil inside. Kofi mumbled something about a late meeting and went straight to the bathroom, avoiding her gaze. It was a simple interaction, yet Amina felt the growing chasm between them. She wanted to ask more, demand the truth, but instead, she swallowed her words, feeling a deep sense of helplessness. She had always believed in the strength of their relationship, in the love that had built their lives together, but now doubt began to cloud everything. Amina knew something had changed, but she couldn't yet put her finger on it. The next morning, as she went about her usual routine, Amina tried to dismiss her worries. She prepared breakfast for the children, sorted through orders for the bakery, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. But her mind kept drifting back to Kofi, his coldness, his distant manner. She could sense the tension in the air, even in the way he kissed her goodbye before leaving for work. It was too quick, too perfunctory. Amina had once cherished those moments, but now they seemed hollow. In the days that followed, Amina became more attuned to Kofi's behavior. She noticed him checking his phone obsessively, texting in the middle of the night, and always rushing out of the house in the mornings, as though something, or someone, was calling him. The suspicions she had buried deep within her began to bubble to the surface, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore them, the truth seemed to be lurking just out of reach. Then, one evening, everything changed. It was as if the universe had been holding its breath, waiting for Amina to uncover the truth. She arrived home early from the bakery, intending to surprise Kofi with his favorite dinner. As she entered their bedroom, she saw his phone lying on the bed, face up, a message from an unknown number flashing across the screen. Amina's heart skipped a beat as she read the words, "I can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you so much." It was a simple text, but it was enough to shatter the illusion of her perfect life. Amina stood frozen, the phone in her hand, her mind racing. Her world crumbled in that moment. This was it, the truth she had been dreading. The man she had loved, the man who had been her partner in every sense of the word, was betraying her. The calm before the storm had ended. Now, Amina had to decide what to do next. Would she confront Kofi with the evidence, or would she keep the secret to herself? Would she fight for her marriage, or would she take control of the situation in a way no one could ever have expected? What happened next would change everything. Amina's fingers trembled as she held Kofi's phone in her hands, the words of the message staring back at her with an unforgiving clarity. "I can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you so much." The text seemed to burn her eyes, each word a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She felt her breath catch in her throat as the reality of what she was reading settled in. This wasn't a mistake, a misunderstanding, or a fleeting moment of weakness. It was an affair, plain and simple, and Kofi, the man she had shared a life with, was betraying her in a way that felt like a dagger to her heart. The room spun around her as she sat down on the edge of the bed, the phone still clutched in her hand. She stared at the screen, numb, as if she were looking at someone else's life, someone else's betrayal. How had it come to this? How had the man she had trusted above all others, the father of her children, fallen so far? Amina felt as though the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Her perfect world, her perfect marriage, had shattered in an instant, leaving nothing but a painful emptiness in its wake. For a long moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. The silence in the room felt oppressive, suffocating. Every memory of the love she had shared with Kofi, every quiet evening spent talking about their future, every tender moment between them, now seemed like lies. Was it all a lie? She thought about their life together, how they had built it from nothing, how they had shared their hopes, their fears, their dreams. How could he have done this to her? How could he have shattered everything they had worked for, everything they had promised each other? But as the shock began to fade, replaced by a deep, searing anger, Amina realized she had a choice to make. She could let this destroy her, wallow in the hurt and humiliation, or she could take control. She had spent years building her life, her business, her family, and she wasn't about to let this betrayal define her. She wasn't going to become a victim of Kofi's actions. She had been a loyal wife, a loving mother, and she was not going to let him strip her of her dignity. But how could she confront him? How could she make him see the damage he had caused? The first instinct Amina had was to pick up the phone and call Kofi right then, demand answers, force him to explain himself. But something held her back. She needed to process this, to understand what this betrayal meant, to figure out what her next move would be. So, instead of confronting him immediately, she set the phone down on the nightstand and walked out of the room. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to think, to make sense of this situation before she acted. For the next few hours, Amina went through the motions of her day. She made dinner for the kids, helped them with their homework, and did her best to appear normal. But inside, she was anything but. Every minute felt like a battle against the storm raging inside her. How could she continue to go on as if everything was fine when her entire world had been upended? She thought about Kofi, about the man he had been, about the family they had created together. The anger was building, but so was the sadness, the overwhelming grief of realizing that the man she loved was capable of something so cruel. As the evening wore on and the children went to bed, Amina sat down at the kitchen table, the phone still lying there, untouched. Her thoughts turned to the woman who had sent the message. Who was she? How long had the affair been going on? Had Kofi been seeing her for months? Was Amina's entire marriage built on a lie? These questions swirled in her mind like a whirlwind, each one adding to the weight on her shoulders. She couldn't believe how far Kofi had gone to deceive her, to live this double life. He had always been the one who said they would face everything together, no matter what. But now, Amina felt the bitterness of those words. They meant nothing. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Kofi was home. Amina's heart skipped a beat, but she remained still, pretending to focus on the papers in front of her, trying to control the storm inside her. She heard Kofi's footsteps in the hallway, then his voice calling out to her. "Hey, babe, I'm home," he said casually, as if nothing had changed. Amina's heart tightened. How could he be so calm? How could he walk into their home after everything he had done as if nothing was wrong? She didn't respond immediately, wanting to let him stew in the silence, to feel the weight of her coldness. She could hear him moving around the house, getting settled, and a wave of disgust washed over her. The man who had sworn to protect her, who had promised to love her, had broken that trust in the most devastating way. Finally, Amina stood up from the table, her legs shaky, her emotions raw. She walked slowly into the living room, where Kofi was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, his face lighting up when he saw her, but the smile quickly faded when he saw the look in her eyes. Amina didn't say a word. Instead, she walked over to the coffee table and picked up his phone, the one he had left on the counter earlier that day. She placed it in front of him without a word. Kofi's face went pale. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, but Amina stopped him. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked him in the eye. "You don't need to check that," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "I already saw everything." The realization hit him like a blow to the stomach. His eyes widened, and for the first time in their marriage, Amina saw fear in his eyes. She had always known him as a confident, assured man, but in that moment, he was reduced to nothing more than a man caught in a lie. I don't know what you're talking about," Kofi stammered, his voice shaky. Amina took a deep breath, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Kofi. The woman you've been texting. The woman you've been seeing behind my back. I saw the message. I know what's been going on." The room was silent except for the sound of Kofi's shallow breaths. His face was a mixture of guilt, shame, and disbelief. He knew he couldn't deny it anymore. But instead of confessing, instead of owning up to his actions, he sat there in stunned silence, as if he were waiting for the ground to swallow him whole. Amina didn't wait for him to speak. She turned away, unable to look at him any longer. Her heart was breaking, but she refused to let him see her crumble. She had already made a decision, one that would change everything. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking control of her life, her future, and her dignity. Kofi had crossed a line, and now she was going to make him pay the price. Kofi sat there, his back stiffening, his fingers gripping the edges of the couch, as if holding on to any semblance of control in a situation that was quickly spiraling beyond him. Amina's words hung in the air between them, cold and final, each one echoing louder than the next. The silence in the room was deafening, yet Kofi couldn't bring himself to speak. He had spent so long weaving his web of lies, building up his secret life, that now, when confronted with the truth, he was paralyzed by the weight of his own guilt. Amina didn't wait for him to speak. She wasn't looking for excuses. She wasn't seeking his apologies. She was beyond that now. Amina turned to face him again, her eyes steely with resolve. "I want the truth, Kofi. I don't want any more lies. I don't care about your reasons or excuses. I just want you to tell me why you did it. Why you betrayed everything we built." Her voice was calm, but beneath it was the fury of a woman who had been wronged in the worst way imaginable. She had trusted him with her heart, with her life, and he had shattered it in an instant. His silence, his inability to answer, made the betrayal feel even worse. It was as if he couldn't even find the words to explain himself, or worse, he didn't care enough to try. Kofi opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the words had abandoned him. He had always been quick-witted, a smooth talker who could charm anyone, but in the face of Amina's cold fury, all his usual tactics failed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't what you think, Amina. It wasn't supposed to happen." Amina let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the stillness. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You think that excuses everything? You think that makes it all better? You had a choice, Kofi. You always had a choice, and you chose to lie, to deceive me. You chose her." Her eyes locked on his, and for the first time, he saw the woman he had once loved, her strength, her pride, her fire. And it terrified him. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Kofi continued, his voice faltering. He stood up, as though suddenly needing to move, but Amina stepped back, raising a hand to stop him. She wouldn't allow him to close the gap between them. He had violated that trust, and now it was up to her to reclaim her power. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" Amina's voice was low, dangerously calm. "You didn't mean to hurt me, and yet here we are. You didn't mean to, but you did it anyway. Do you know how that feels, Kofi? To wake up one day and realize the man you've loved for so many years has been lying to you? To feel like your entire life, everything you believed in, was built on a lie? You're not sorry, Kofi. You're sorry you got caught." Her words hit him like a slap, each one stinging more than the last. For the first time, Kofi felt truly vulnerable, exposed in a way that made him wish for the comfort of the lies he had told for so long. He had been so certain of his ability to get away with it, so confident that Amina would never find out. But now that the truth had come out, now that the mask had been ripped off, he didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to fix what was broken. Amina stood there, her posture straight, her eyes never leaving his. She had spent too many years putting everyone else's needs before her own. She had built her life around Kofi, around their family, their dreams. And now, in the face of this betrayal, she realized that she had forgotten the most important person in her life, herself. She had given him everything, trusted him with her soul, and he had taken that trust and destroyed it. But she wasn't going to let him continue to destroy her. Not anymore. Kofi took a hesitant step toward her, but Amina held up a hand again, stopping him. "Don't," she said, her voice firm. "Don't come any closer. You don't get to do that. Not now. Not after what you've done." Kofi stopped, his face a mixture of guilt, regret, and confusion. He couldn't understand what was happening. This wasn't the Amina he knew. The woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, who had supported him when things got hard. This was a woman who was standing up for herself, for the first time in their marriage. This was a woman who was no longer willing to be a passive participant in her own life. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said, his voice shaky. "I never wanted this to happen. I love you, Amina. I swear, I do. But it was a mistake. It wasn't like you think it was. It was just something that happened." Amina's eyes narrowed as she regarded him. You think I'm stupid, don't you, Kofi? You think I'm going to believe that? You think I'm going to accept this weak, pathetic excuse? I deserve better than that. And so do our children. Do you know how much this will hurt them, Kofi? Do you know what this will do to our family? His face turned pale at the mention of the children, but Amina wasn't finished. I don't care about your excuses. I don't care about your regrets. What I care about is me. I care about what I deserve. And I deserve respect. I deserve honesty. And you took that from me. Kofi opened his mouth to respond, but Amina held up a hand, silencing him. No more, Kofi. No more lies. No more pretending. You have broken me, but I will not stay broken. I'm done. I'm done with you. Amina's words hit him like a ton of bricks, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of the truth crushing him. He had thought he could fix this, that somehow he could smooth it over, but he realized, too late, that the damage had been done. He had pushed her too far, taken her for granted for too long. And now, there was nothing he could do to fix it. Amina turned and walked toward the door, her heart heavy with the finality of the moment. She had made her decision, and there was no going back. She wouldn't waste another minute of her life trying to fix something that had been broken beyond repair. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at Kofi. I want you to leave. I want you to leave tonight. Take your things and go. Kofi stood frozen, staring at her, unable to move. The woman he had once known so well was now a stranger to him. She was no longer the loving, forgiving wife who would wait for him to come back, no matter what. She had changed, and in that moment, Amina knew she had taken control of her life. It was no longer about him, about their marriage, it was about her. And she was done waiting for someone who didn't deserve her. With that, Amina walked out of the room, her heart pounding, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Kofi sat in stunned silence long after Amina had left the room, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. Her departure had left an emptiness in the house that he had never felt before. It was as if the life they had built together, the memories they had created, had all been stripped away in one fell swoop. He had thought he could handle this. He had convinced himself that Amina would never find out, that the affair could remain a secret, hidden away like a dark corner of his soul. But now, as he sat alone in the silence of their home, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The guilt gnawed at him, but it wasn't just guilt, there was something deeper, something more primal. Regret. Regret for how easily he had allowed everything to slip away. Regret for the woman he had betrayed. And a sickening sense of self-loathing. What had he really expected to happen? That he could juggle a family, a career, and an affair with no consequences? That the woman who had loved him unconditionally for years would just forgive him when the truth came to light? He had been delusional, and now he was paying the price. Kofi didn't sleep that night. He sat in the darkness, the house eerily quiet, listening to the soft sounds of the night outside. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the street, felt amplified in the silence of the house. He couldn't shake the image of Amina's face, her eyes full of anger and hurt, the words she had said replaying in his mind over and over. I deserve better than that. The words stung him like a physical blow. They were a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. He had always thought he could get away with it, that he could charm his way out of anything. But Amina wasn't buying his excuses. She had seen through him, and now, there was nothing left to hide. As the hours passed, Kofi found himself thinking about the affair. He thought about the woman he had been seeing, the woman who had made him feel desired, who had given him the attention and affection that Amina, in his mind, had stopped giving him. The woman who had filled a void inside him, one that he had convinced himself could only be filled by someone new. But the more he thought about it, the more empty that relationship felt. It had been a distraction, a momentary escape from the complexities of his life, but now, sitting alone in the dark, he realized it had been nothing more than a fantasy, a fleeting thing that couldn't hold a candle to what he had lost. He had traded something real for something fake, and now he was left to face the consequences. The following day, Kofi tried to reach Amina. He called her repeatedly, sending text after text, each one more desperate than the last. But there was no response. She wasn't picking up the phone. She wasn't answering his messages. For the first time, Kofi realized how completely out of control he had become. Amina wasn't the kind of woman who would easily forgive him. She wasn't someone who would just let him walk back into her life as though nothing had happened. She had seen the man he truly was, and that man had betrayed her trust in the worst way possible. Kofi spent the day pacing around their home, trying to gather his thoughts, but they were scattered, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together anymore. He thought about their children, how they would react when they found out. The thought of them being hurt by his actions, by his selfishness, crushed him. Amina had always been the rock of their family, the one who held everything together. He had relied on her strength, her stability. But now, he had torn all that apart. How could he explain to their children why their mother was so hurt? How could he face them, knowing that he had failed them, too? Later that evening, Amina returned home. The sight of her standing in the doorway, her face set in a mask of cold determination, made Kofi's heart sink. She had changed. The woman he had known, the woman who had always been patient and forgiving, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had made a decision that didn't involve him anymore. Amina stepped inside the house, not saying a word. Kofi could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she carried herself. She wasn't angry anymore. She was beyond that. This was the calm before the storm. "I don't want to talk about this anymore, Kofi," Amina said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I've made my decision." Kofi opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? What could he possibly say that would make a difference now? His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He had always thought he could control everything, that he could fix anything. But now, as he looked at Amina, he realized that the damage was beyond repair. The trust they had built together was gone, and with it, their future. "I've already packed my things," Amina continued, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm taking the kids and leaving. You can stay here if you want, but I won't be coming back. I need space, I need time, and I need to find myself again. I can't live like this anymore, Kofi. I can't live in a house built on lies." Kofi felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had known, deep down, that this was a possibility, but hearing it out loud, hearing Amina speak with such finality, made it all the more real. She wasn't asking for his forgiveness. She wasn't asking for his approval. She was making a choice to walk away from him, from the marriage they had built, from the family they had created. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. He didn't know what else to say. The apology felt hollow, empty, like a last-ditch effort to salvage something that was beyond saving. Amina shook her head. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Kofi. Sorry doesn't undo the damage. I wish it could, but it can't. You've broken me. And you've broken us." There was nothing else to say. Kofi stood there, staring at her, his heart heavy with the weight of his own mistakes. As Amina walked past him to gather her things, Kofi realized that he had lost more than just a wife. He had lost the respect of the woman he had once adored, the trust of his children, and the life they had worked so hard to build together. He had lost it all, and there was no way to get it back. The sound of the front door closing behind Amina echoed in the house, and Kofi was left standing there alone, his heart shattered, his world completely undone. He had thought he could fix this, but he realized, too late, that some things can't be fixed. Some things are just broken beyond repair. The days that followed Amina's departure were a blur for Kofi. The house, once full of the sounds of family life, now felt hollow and empty, each room echoing with the silence of his own mistakes. The children, too, had been distant, quiet, withdrawn. Kofi had tried to reach out to them, but they avoided him, sensing the tension, the gulf that had opened between him and Amina. The life they had once known, one full of warmth, love, and togetherness, seemed irreparably broken. Kofi spent his nights lying awake in the cold emptiness of their bed, staring at the ceiling, as his mind replayed every moment leading up to this, every lie, every betrayal, every broken promise. He had failed them all, but more than anyone else, he had failed Amina. Kofi knew he had to make things right, but he didn't know where to begin. He had no idea how to fix the gaping wound he had carved in his marriage. The guilt and regret weighed heavily on him, but there was something else now, too, a burning desire to change, to become a man worthy of Amina's trust again. It wasn't about winning her back, it was about proving to her, and to himself, that he was capable of redemption. But how? He wasn't sure what the first step was, only that he needed to take it. For the first time in years, Kofi took a long, hard look at himself in the mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. He had spent so long hiding behind the illusion of control, behind the facade of a perfect family, that he had lost touch with who he really was. He had allowed his desires and his ego to lead him down a path that ultimately destroyed everything he had worked so hard to build. The truth was inescapable: he had been selfish, reckless, and blinded by his own arrogance. He had taken Amina for granted, assuming that she would always forgive him, always be there, no matter what. But he had underestimated her. And now he was paying the price. Determined to make a change, Kofi began by reaching out to those who could help him confront the root of his problems. He contacted a therapist, someone who could guide him through the process of understanding why he had betrayed Amina and how he could begin to rebuild himself. The sessions were uncomfortable at first, as Kofi was forced to confront the ugly truths about his behavior, his choices, and his inability to deal with the deep-seated issues that had driven him to act the way he did. But with each session, he began to understand himself more, his fear of intimacy, his need for validation, his inability to communicate his feelings without resorting to lies and deceit. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, and Kofi began to see a path forward, a path that required not just apologies, but real, lasting change. Meanwhile, Amina had found a new strength within herself. She had always been resilient, but in the wake of Kofi's betrayal, she found a deeper sense of purpose. She had spent weeks pouring herself into her work and into her children, ensuring that their lives, as much as possible, returned to a sense of normalcy. But the emotional toll was still there. The pain of Kofi's betrayal hadn't gone away, it still lingered in the corners of her mind, in the spaces where their love had once flourished. Yet, she was beginning to understand that she couldn't live in the past. She couldn't keep holding on to the anger and resentment that had poisoned their relationship. If she wanted to move forward, to heal, she had to let go of the bitterness and embrace her own strength. One afternoon, as Amina sat with her children, watching them laugh and play, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. It wasn't that she had forgiven Kofi, not yet, at least, but it was the realization that she could stand on her own. She could raise her children without him, build a new life, and find happiness again. It was a terrifying thought, but also one that gave her hope. She wasn't defined by Kofi's actions. She wasn't defined by the pain he had caused her. She was stronger than that. Kofi, on the other hand, was still in the midst of his own transformation. He continued with therapy, but the road to redemption was long and arduous. He began to make small changes in his life, cutting ties with the woman he had been seeing, distancing himself from the toxic habits that had enabled his infidelity. But every day, he felt the weight of his past mistakes. He knew that the real work wouldn't come from external changes, it would come from within. He had to prove, not just to Amina, but to himself, that he was capable of becoming a better man. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to try. As the weeks passed, Kofi began to rebuild his relationship with his children. He spent more time with them, showing up for the small moments, making sure they knew he was there for them. But he didn't push Amina. He knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. He had to prove to her that he was worthy of her trust again, but he understood that he couldn't rush that process. If he truly wanted to change, he had to let go of his need for instant results. He had to be patient. One day, after months of silence, Amina reached out to Kofi. It was a simple message, but it was the first sign of any possibility of reconciliation. "We need to talk," it said. Kofi's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing with a mix of hope and anxiety. He wasn't sure what this meant, whether it was a chance for them to talk things through or a final goodbye. But whatever it was, he knew that he had to be ready. He had to be honest with her, no matter how difficult the conversation might be. When they met, there was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic confession of love. Instead, they sat down together, the air thick with unspoken words. Amina didn't ask for an apology, she didn't need to. Instead, she wanted to know if Kofi had truly changed, if he had learned from his mistakes, if he was ready to be the man she had always hoped he could be. It wasn't about grand gestures or promises, it was about consistency, about showing her, through his actions, that he was different. Kofi listened carefully, his heart open, and for the first time in a long time, he was able to speak honestly about his feelings. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply asking for a chance to prove that he could be better. The conversation didn't end with immediate forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Amina wasn't ready to open her heart fully to Kofi again, but she was willing to give him a chance to show her the man he could be. And Kofi, for his part, understood that this was the real test. It wasn't about winning her back, it was about earning her trust again, one step at a time. He knew it would take time, but for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had begun the long journey toward redemption, and while he wasn't sure where it would lead, he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't giving up. As Kofi and Amina parted ways that day, there was a sense of tentative optimism in the air. They had a long road ahead of them, but they were both willing to take it, step by step. Kofi knew that the consequences of his actions would follow him for a long time, but he was no longer running from them. For the first time, he was ready to face the truth, to rebuild what he had broken, and to become the man that Amina deserved. The road to redemption was long and uncertain, but it was the only path worth taking. The months that followed were a period of slow, painful growth for both Kofi and Amina. They navigated a delicate, often uneasy truce, one forged not by forgiveness but by the raw, open truth of their feelings. There was no dramatic declaration of love, no sudden reconciliation. Instead, it was a quiet process, one where each moment, each conversation, was like a small step toward rebuilding a life that had seemed irreparably broken. Kofi continued his therapy, and Amina, in her own way, worked to heal the wounds left by his betrayal. There were still days when the weight of what had happened would crash down on her, when the memories of Kofi's deceit would overwhelm her, but she had also learned to lean into her own strength, her own sense of identity that wasn't defined by the man who had once been her world. They both began to understand that healing wasn't a race, it was a marathon, one that would take time, patience, and an unshakable commitment to change. Kofi, for the first time in his life, began to live in the reality of his actions, not hiding behind excuses or lies. He understood now that the love Amina had given him was not a guarantee, not a forever thing, unless he earned it. It wasn't a matter of just saying the right words or making empty promises, it was about demonstrating, through every action, every decision, that he was worthy of her love again. He spent time with their children, not just in the easy moments, but in the challenging ones, when their pain and anger were still fresh, when they reminded him, through their words and actions, that they had been hurt by him, too. Kofi made sure they knew he was there for them, that he was working to become a better father, a better man. Amina, meanwhile, had started to reimagine her life without the burden of bitterness. She had no intention of rushing into forgiveness, but she was no longer trapped by the past. She found herself growing stronger, more independent, and, slowly, more open to the possibility of love again, not just with Kofi, but in all aspects of her life. She found joy in her work, in the moments she shared with their children, in rediscovering parts of herself that had been overshadowed by her devotion to her family. She had started to think about the future not as a continuation of the life she had once known, but as a new chapter, a chance to build something stronger, something more authentic. Yet, there remained an undeniable tug of connection with Kofi, an undeniable history between them that she couldn't simply erase. She had come to realize that forgiveness was not a one-time act, it was a process, one that she had to be ready for when the time was right. And then, one rainy afternoon, the test came. It started with an unexpected phone call from the woman Kofi had been seeing during their separation. She was not angry or confrontational, instead, her voice, when she spoke, was calm, almost apologetic. She had heard rumors of Kofi's efforts to reconcile with Amina, of his efforts to change, and she wanted to clear the air. The affair, she explained, had been a mistake. She admitted that her role in the affair had never been innocent, it had been born of her own insecurities and desires, not from any real love for Kofi. But now, hearing about his efforts to rebuild his life, she wanted him to know that she wished him nothing but the best. She made it clear that she had no intention of interfering anymore. She hoped, for his sake and Amina's, that they could find a way to heal. Kofi sat on the couch after the phone call, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of it all hit him. This was it, the moment where everything he had worked for, everything he had changed, would be tested. Amina was sitting across the room, reading a book, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. Kofi could feel the tension building in the air, a question hanging over everything: should he tell her? Should he admit to what had happened in the past, to the things he had hidden from her? The answer, he knew, was clear. He had promised to be honest. He had promised to change, to rebuild the trust they had once shared. And so, without hesitation, he walked over to Amina and sat down beside her. He took a deep breath, his chest tight with nerves, but he knew there was no turning back now. "Amina," he began, his voice low but steady, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Amina looked up from her book, her expression soft but cautious. She could sense the gravity of the moment, the seriousness in his tone. "I spoke to the woman I was seeing," Kofi continued, his gaze steady but vulnerable. "She called me today, and she wanted to let me know that she no longer wants any part of our lives. I needed to hear that from her, but it doesn't change what I did. I was wrong, and I should have told you about this long ago. I should have been upfront with you, no matter how painful the truth might be. But I wasn't. And for that, I am sorry. I want you to know that I've ended all contact with her. There's nothing left between us." Amina sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing his words. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, the weight of his confession, but there was something else, something deeper. This wasn't just about Kofi's past actions. It was about the trust that had been broken, the promises that had been made and shattered. She had no idea how she should feel. A part of her wanted to scream, to lash out, to express the anger that still simmered inside her. But another part of her, the part that had come to peace with the idea of moving forward, simply wanted to listen, to understand, to process this information in her own way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was a trace of sadness in it. "Why didn't you tell me this before, Kofi? Why did you keep hiding this from me?" Kofi's heart broke at the question, the pain in her voice cutting through him like a blade. He had no easy answer, no justification that could make it right. He had done it because he was scared, scared of losing her, scared of facing the truth of what he had done. But those excuses were hollow now. He had no right to hide the truth from her. I thought I could protect you from the pain," he whispered. "But in the end, I only hurt you more. I was selfish, Amina. I was afraid of facing what I had done, but that doesn't excuse my actions. You deserved better than that." There was a long silence, a silence that stretched between them like an ocean, vast and unbridgeable. But then Amina reached out, her hand resting lightly on Kofi's. "I'm not sure if I can ever fully forgive you, Kofi," she said quietly. "But I'm willing to try. Not for you. Not for the past. But for the future, for our family, for our children." Kofi nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. He knew that this wasn't the end of their journey, it was just another beginning. But in that moment, he realized something important. The road to redemption would never be easy. It would never be without its tests, its trials, its pain. But it was a road worth walking, and with Amina by his side, even in uncertainty, he knew they could face whatever came next together.